Okay, I think we're live. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on Facebook Live. We're doing another one of our virtual events, and today I'm so happy to be joined by Kate Riordan and Lucy Foley, all the way from Europe. How exciting. So if you are new to these events, we've been doing them quite a bit recently. If you have any questions, you can put them in the comments, and I'm going to be checking those while the authors chat, and we'll get to those questions in the comments a little bit later on. But right now, I'll go ahead and get to the introductions and get this underway. So Kate Riordan is a British writer and journalist. After working on staff at The Guardian and Time Out London, she left London for the Cotswolds in order to concentrate on writing novels. Her historical novel, Firecombe Manor, was published in Harper in 2015, and she's here to talk about her brand new release, The Heatwave. Lucy Foley studied English literature at Durham University and University College London and worked for several years as a fiction editor in the publishing industry. She's the author of the Book of Lost and Found, The Invitation, The Hunting Party, and now The Guest List, which has been all over the bestseller charts. Great congratulations to her. She lives in London. All right, ladies, have a great chat. I'll be back in a little bit, and have fun.
Thank you.
Of course.
So we're on our own now.
Yes, yeah. Hello.
Hello. So should we introduce our books, I suppose?
I think so, yeah. You go first, Kate.
Oh, nasty. I should have made you. Okay, so this is actually, I don't know if you agree, Lucy, this is like the hardest bit is describing your book in like a pithy sentence.
So hard.
It's so hard.
I think as an author, you want to kind of tell everyone everything it's about, don't you? You want to give them the whole story, but then you would literally just read the book. So
yeah. And you're kind of going into subplots and then I did this, and anyway, I'll now give it a go and you can see how badly I did it. So The Heatwave is a book set in Provence in the summer of 1993, but it also goes back to the 70s and 80s. And it's the story of Sylvie, who's a single mother returning to France for the first time in 10 years. And it's really the story of what happened 10 years earlier to her eldest daughter, Elodie, who is dead when we enter the book. So it's really a kind of mystery, sort of what happened kind of book. See, that was really inarticulate, but short. So that's something.
Yeah, no, I loved it. It's brilliant. It's such a great book. Makes me want to read it again.
Oh, thank you.
So it's The Guest List. I hope that's coming up the right way around. The Guest List is a murder mystery set on an island off the west coast of Ireland. It's quite hard to say. And it's set at a wedding. And it should be this wonderful, glamorous occasion, Jules and Will are the perfect golden couple. The only problem is they've invited some guests who are bringing some rather nasty baggage with them in the form of buried resentments and secrets. And really the tension starts to build from the rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding onwards, to the extent that just after the wedding cake has been cut, a broken body is found in the darkness beyond the tent. Who done it? Should do like a da da da.
I could have done that if you primed me. I would have done it.
Yeah. Should have had it cute.
It is an excellent book. I've got it here. I've got my lovely British proof here, actually, which was very exciting. I don't know if you can see that. But yeah, fantastic book. And a brilliant follow-up to The Hunting Party, of course, as well. So we can probably talk about both of those if you're happy to do that.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, actually, I've written a list down of things I wanted to talk about, but I thought it was nice. Yay! It'd be really nice to talk about location, because I think, you know, we both went straight in with where they were set, because I think that's probably important to both of us. So mine in Provence, yours in Ireland, which is hard to say, an island off Ireland. How, I mean, in terms of as a writer, but also books you love to read, I mean, is location and setting as almost as a character in its own right something that you're trying to kind of achieve and looking for?
Oh, absolutely. And there's this, I was reading through the kind of rules of detective fiction the other day that were originally written in like the 1920s, I think, or maybe even before that. And one of the rules is there should never be sort of too much description given over to location or character. So it's this idea that the plot is the key thing. And as a writer, I would want to absolutely refute that, because I think for me, the location is so important. And you know, in both of our books, I think that sense of isolation really kind of driving plot in a way, and sort of really affecting the way the characters behave. In the guest list, you've got this kind of remote island. The boats sort of leave the guests and depart, and then you've got a storm coming from kind of out in the Atlantic. So the boats can't come and collect them. They literally can't leave. They're sort of trapped on this island, and that really, I think, in a way, creates this whole kind of closed circle setting for the book that was so important for the action to play out. And so when I read a book, setting is so important to me, and it was when I read your book. There's a wonderful description right at the beginning of the thunder. I'm gonna totally paraphrase it wrong now. The thunder rolling around the hills like marbles in a bowl.
Yes, that's perfect.
And that has stuck with me because it's just so beautiful and so vivid, I think. And you did a big research trip, I think, for this book.
I did. It was such an excuse because, I mean, I can, totally write a book about France from home. I've been a lot to France. I don't really need to go and do research. But I did take a month in France. I went in May last year, and it was amazing, and I got some extra kind of atmospheric touches that I probably wouldn't have thought of. And also what was really interesting is that loads of stuff I'd already written was then similar in the house that we rented for a month, and that to a kind of creepy degree, and that really helped. It was spooky, I mean, really spooky, and I haven't got time to go into them all now, but funny little kind of details. And there was a storm on, I'll give you one example, there was a storm on about the second night, which is what happens to the characters. And in the book, there's a loose shutter kind of banging in the bedroom of the eldest daughter where she had been as a child. And, I had a storm and there was a shutter banging and all that kind of stuff. And it was really strange, and the same wallpaper in the bedroom and weird things like that. But like you, I think setting is hugely important, and I think it does a lot of work for the writer, actually, if you've got a good one. You were talking about it driving the plot on, and I think it does, and it also ramps up the tension, and it helps with the suspense, particularly if you've got a closed room, basically. And I suppose I've got almost, my claustrophobia comes from maybe the weather in a funny way. I've also got forest fires that are kind of creeping closer, and I think that almost acts as a kind of pressure cooker, like your island location does. But it was really interesting what you were saying about the rules of detective fiction, and I totally refute those as well. I think you're really missing a trick if you don't use everything you could, and I do think that you're kind of following on in a sense from a tradition that's come from people like Agatha Christie. But no offense to the great Agatha, but I prefer your kind of book because you've got all that plot element. No, I do, because you've got the puzzle and the kind of working out and the red herrings and all that, which is really fun. But because the characters are really nuanced and rich and interesting, you care about them. And I sometimes find with old-fashioned detective novels that it is quite cold. It kind of leaves me quite cold because I don't really care about the people. So I think, why not use it all if you can?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that, actually, and whether that's something that as kind of modern readers we expect more of that sort of psychological insight into the characters, whether back in the day they simply didn't, it was more because they can feel more like types, in those sort of original detective novels. I mean, one of the things though that I think Agatha Christie does so well, and one of the things that I always try, and because I am by nature a waffler, I want to give you like all of the description, I want to kind of really take you there, and I want to tell you everything about all the characters, but rereading her books kind of always brings me back to the importance of plot. Because there is no fat whatsoever on her plots, and that might be sometimes a negative thing in terms of if you want that psychological insight, but it really it gets me to sort of pull my, I can't think of the expression, like
I know what you mean.
Pull myself together a bit to kind of remind myself to come back to that importance of plot. And did you find that with writing The Heat Wave? Did you plot kind of very carefully? Did you know exactly where you would go at sort of every stage?
I'd love to say yes, but no. I was going to ask you the whole plotter or pantser thing, as in, for those who don't know, either you're a plotter and a planner, or you're a pantser, so you fly by the seat of your pants. And I think I have very good intentions to be a plotter, because I know it will help me, because I'm a waffler as well. And I'm terrible for backstories. I go off on kind of, and then I want to do their whole life. And so I try and plot very carefully, and then I go off on tangents, because I think when you're plotting at an early stage, you don't know your characters very well, and you don't know how they're going to rub up against each other. And so then they start, you know, and I always say this stuff about characters kind of coming to life on their own, and I'm very aware it sounds very pretentious, but it's true, they do take on a life of their own, and then they sometimes rebel against your nice plan. So I tend to have kind of way markers where I kind of think, I want to get them there at the end, and I know what the premise is, and I know where they're going to be at the beginning. And I've got these various points that I would quite like to, kind of beats, I suppose, that I want to hit. But in terms of, you know, but a lot of that will get jigged around, and, you know, little twists will come in. So I wrote the Heatwave quite out of order, actually. And I have a very weird working method. I'm quite resistant to writing. I love it when I do it and I have a good day doing it, but I often have days where I just sort of waft around not doing it and feeling bad about it. And I think, I completely lost my train of thought now, but I think it's one of those things where you just have to wing it a bit and not worry too much, and just do what you can. And I try and just write a scene that interests me, and I'll slot it in somewhere. And so I tend to work in Scrivener, because I can move things about really easily. Because if you've got a huge big Word document, and I'm sure there are features in Word that are beyond me that would help me with this, but with Scrivener, you will know, you can just literally move sections up and down very easily. And that's been the saving of me a lot. I mean, do you find with, you know, when you're doing a bit of backstory, and also with both your detective novels, you've got different viewpoints. So there's a lot to, you're not only dealing with characters' backstories, or maybe, you know, where they are now, but for instance, in this book, chronologically, you're quite difficult, because you're sort of in the present, and then it's all flashback, really, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got
in a funny way.
Yeah, I mean, but I write, I think, in exactly the same way you do, in that I write the bits that interest me first. So, you know, because it's exactly that. You have to be writing something that excites you, and it definitely doesn't excite me to kind of write chronologically. No. And I have some scenes much clearer in my head, and as you say, they are the kind of way markers, you know, around which I've sort of designed the rest of the plot. So I know that if I've sort of written those first, those kind of really clear, vivid scenes, I can sort of hook the other scenes between them, if you know what I mean. And Scrivener is amazing for that. I think when I realized that I didn't have to have just like one massive kind of 100,000 word document, scrolling through, like trying to find where you've slotted things in, and like where you've repeated things. Oh my God. So you can just sort of
revelation.
Such a revelation, because you can kind of modulise it, can't you? But one writer I did an event with described it as, she was like appalled that I didn't write chronologically. She said, it's like eating all the toppings off a pizza, which I just thought was brilliant.
Oh yeah.
Totally what I do.
I would be the burnt crust. I love the burnt crust more than the toppings.
Yeah, true. Yeah, so you know, you leave that. Yeah. But I think I'm the same as you in that I try really hard to plot, and I do plot. You know, most of the book out before I start writing. Because that feels really important to have a kind of, for me to have a roadmap. But then as soon as I start writing, everything changes. You know, and as you say, certain characters demand more screen time, or behave in ways that you hadn't quite anticipated. And actually with both books, I started off writing and I thought I knew who'd done it. And it actually changed about a third of the way in for both books. And actually the book I'm reading at the moment, I've had exactly the same experience. So I suddenly had this revelation and realised that it would be much more exciting if someone else did it. And actually, I think as a writer, you have to leave room for those moments that kind of come from left field and really surprise you. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think also if you've actually written it, the first bit maybe with someone else in mind, it will end up being a really convincing red herring, because you actually did have them in mind as the, you know, so I think that must actually be really effective. You've almost tricked yourself.
That's what I hope. That's what I hope. Yeah.
That justifies it as well, I think. So that's really interesting. When we're on our own sometime, I'll ask you, so we don't want to do spoilers for anyone. I will ask you who
originally did it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. How funny.
I was really pleased when I also discovered that was not dissimilar to what Agatha Christie did, apparently, with a lot of her books. Because you'd assume with the great Agatha, you know, and they're so tightly plotted, you would assume that she knew absolutely exactly everything that was going to happen before she started writing. But apparently she would often write the book, and then she would kind of go back and work out who would be the least likely and then
make them
write them in. I mean, there are some of her books that you think she must have known from the beginning, because it's just so, you know, carefully done. But
I'm always in awe of writers in the past who were doing all that kind of editing and messing about with sort of typewriters and handwritten notes and, you know, pages, and I just don't know how they actually did it. I mean,
I can't even imagine.
We're moaning about Word, you know, and it's sort of, it's kind of mind-boggling.
That said, I write in notebooks first. I'm probably going too much into the writing stuff, but I write in notebooks first because I find that and this is going to sound very kind of wafty, but I find that very freeing, creative. You know, you can just like get the words down, not worry. It's what you were saying, not worry too much about getting them kind of exactly right. Just kind of feel your way into it. I think otherwise I would just sit in front of like a blank screen and a blinking cursor for a whole morning, like worried about writing that sentence.
Yeah, no, and I actually do the same too. I kind of go off with a notebook, and I go to, it makes me sound like a complete dipsomaniac, but we've got lots of lovely pubs around here, and I don't always drink alcohol, but I go off with my notebook, and there's often nice open fires in the winter, because I think cafes are too noisy for me. Whereas if you go to a pub at like 11 a.m, there's just me.
You're the only one.
And I am having coffee. But
it's actually, I love a cafe. I love that kind of background noise. For me, that's like, you know, it sort of then doesn't feel too much like work. I can sort of pretend that I'm not really working, and then the work might actually happen, I think.
That's so similar, because I do the under the radar thing as well. I'll often write kind of after hours, because no one's expecting me to work at 8 o'clock at night or on this journey, so then I will. It's very perverse. But yes, I could talk about like process and all that kind of thing all night, but I was going to ask you about, we've both sort of, you more obviously than me, but we both sort of changed genre, and we actually know each other as friends because we were writing historical fiction originally, and have both kind of moved away from that, you 2 books ago and me more with this one. And I just was interested how you found that change, and whether actually, I don't know if this is kind of private publisher stuff, but whether, you know, some people take a pseudonym when they change. Neither of us have. And I don't know if that was ever discussed, or if you ever thought of doing that. I mean, I thought it was great that you didn't actually, because there's the essence of your writing is still there in all the books. So, you know, why change your name? But I was just interested to know what happened.
Yeah, no, I mean, I did definitely think about the pseudonym thing, because it felt, so I'd written 3 historicals before I started writing the Hunting Party, and it felt like starting all over again. It felt totally new, like I didn't have a clue what I was doing, and yeah, I was just having a go at writing something. It was kind of like a side hustle, but I think because
that paid off.
Yeah, it worked in the end, but it did, in a way, I think that was also very freeing. You know, it was like I hadn't really told anyone I was doing it. I had no real sort of expectation about what was going to come out. It was just sort of writing for myself, which I think writing the first book had been like, you know, writing with a reader in mind, but also not knowing whether it would ever see the light of day. And that was really fun. I really enjoyed that, and found it very kind of I mean, I loved writing the historicals, but I found it very kind of liberating just writing in like a modern vernacular.
Oh, yeah. I love that.
It felt much more immediate. Did you find the same?
Yeah, that was great, because I mean, I was never massive on, I mean, oh God, I shouldn't say this, but I didn't ever go to the British Library for like 10 years and do loads of research, because I just thought it actually gets in the way of the storytelling if you're not, if you do too much. But it was hugely liberating to, I mean, it set my present day as 93, as I said in the book, but one of the characters, Emma, is basically 13, 14, which is how old I was roughly around then. So it's a bit further, you know, there's no internet and there's no mobiles, which is quite useful for plotting reasons, actually. But it's still recent enough that I didn't have to check any of the stuff, because I can remember. And I know what kind of stuff people were drinking in cafes in the 90s in the south of France, because I was there. And I found that great. And actually the book I'm working on now is completely contemporary. So suddenly there is social media and there's online dating and all this kind of stuff. And that's like, it's fun. It's really fun. After, you know, my last historical book, well, it might not be my last, but the historical book I wrote before The Heatwave, The Stranger, was set in the Second World War. And that's such a well-known period. You know, historians have pored over every kind of second and minute of the Second World War. And so there's a real pressure to kind of get it right, but also talk about something new and like a fresh angle. Whereas with this, you can be much freer, and you can draw on your own experiences a bit more, and your own, I think there are certain eternals with humans, you know, that people in Victorian times were still jealous and they still fell in love and they still hated people. But there are other things to do with being a woman in the 21st century, which is unique. And that you have to actually make quite a leap to go backwards in time, and it's nice to sort of just be in your own experience somehow. So no, I've really enjoyed it, and if hopefully I can emulate some of your amazing success in doing the jump, because you've done so well, and it's been our little gang of friends have watched you, and we're all like, yeah, Lucy.
It's happening for your book. It's just everywhere. It's just, I keep seeing that beautiful cover. It's just so,
it is a nice cover.
You should hold it up, because you just want to dive into it. It's just gorgeous.
It is. They did me proud with the cover. And actually that was a small fact that's interesting for me. I don't know if it's interesting for anyone else, but that was my American cover. And like you, I have a different publisher in the UK, and actually Penguin in the UK loved it so much that they kind of bought the rights to it from Grand Central, because they just, I mean, I had a beautiful UK cover, but they put the two together and it just leapt out.
No contest. Yeah.
So that
it's really it feels really cinematic to me, actually. It sort of reminds me of films like have you ever seen The Swimming Pool by Françoise Ozon and La Piscine, which is also The Swimming Pool in French, but is a totally different film.
Yeah,
it reminds me of both of those. Like,
good. That's a
thrillers.
No, that's a great compliment, because I actually I had that. I don't know which one now, because I actually saw it in the French in France. I think it was Swimming Pool, the one with Charlotte Rampling in.
Yes, and the young woman. Yeah.
And that's so. And I had that kind of, it's that heat, and you can always hear the kind of cicadas in the background. It's that kind of, you know, all the time. And I really wanted to have that slightly oppressive heat almost.
Are you sort of, I was wondering, are you inspired by film and your writing kind of as much as you are by kind of books? And are you sort of, are you quite cinematic in the way you write?
I tried to be. I did an English degree, but I did a lot of, because you went to Durham and I went to Exeter, and they're kind of, for Americans that don't know, they're quite similar in some ways. They're quite sort of, I don't want to say anything. I mean, I love my time there, and I stayed for another year and did a master's because I didn't want to leave, but they are very particular. And I'm, in fact, in my new book, I'm using my extra experiences, so that will be interesting. But I did a lot of film in my English degree. So whenever there were film options, I took them. And I think, I was saying I did another event the other night, and I was talking about how important watching good films and particularly good TV dramas, you know, your kind of HBO stuff, I think is so useful if I love writing, and I think my strength is maybe atmosphere and setting, but I worry about plotting and structure because I find that a bit more tricky because of the waffly thing again. And if you watch those kind of series, it's a brilliant lesson in how to plot things out, because they've got these multiple arcs, you know, the kind of the episode arc and the series arc, and leaving space for having another series maybe, or another season, or maybe if they get cancelled halfway through a season, that's got to still make sense. And I think there's no, like you were saying about Agatha Christie, there's no flab, there's no fat, and everybody is working so hard, like every character, every sort of scene. And I think that's a really useful lesson for writers, actually.
Totally. There's actually a brilliant book called, I think it's Screenwriting Tips for Authors, by an author called Alexandra Solokoff, I want to say, who is a screenwriter but also a novelist, who I've met a couple of times. I think she's like self-published it. It's absolutely brilliant. It's so helpful because it literally sets out that structure.
Yeah.
That kind of screenwriting structure for a kind of 90-minute film, or how they would write a sort of, you know, 60-minute 6-episode TV series. And you can see all the bones, and you can see how tight it has to be, and it's all kind of based on like the original 5-act structure and things. It gets very mathematical and kind of blows my mind, but I think it is so helpful to kind of consume other media like that as an author, and podcasts as well, like true crime podcasts.
Yeah, I need to catch up. There's loads I need to catch up with. I loved Serial. I know that was a while ago now, Serial, but I was absolutely glued to that. And that is Sarah, I can't remember her name, but her voice was so sort of soothing, and I was kind of need to listen to Serial again. No, that's really interesting, because I feel exactly the same. Well, maybe film deals will come our way. We can only hope. Well, I'm sure you've probably got a few in the bag, but I'm here if anyone wants to do a film option. That would be
it'd be so cinematic. I want to watch the film of it. It's just really that feel, and that, so saying, that kind of sultry, the summer heat, and the sort of, you know, it's that kind of Garden of Eden idea in a way, that kind of beautiful location, and like the house so vividly described, and the swimming pool, and it all just sounds perfect, and yet there's something kind of evil there. And actually that brings me into a question of mine, which is writing bad characters, you know, because obviously you have, I'm trying not to be really spoilery here, but obviously
I know it's hard
a very bad character who is also a child, and you know, it was fascinating kind of reading and thinking, was that hard to write that character? Did you have to empathize with her a lot? You sort of come to writing her.
It's funny. I had yes, because I mean, I it's impossible not to have any kind of spoilers. Elodie is a very sort of troubled child, like you say. And
troubled. That's
what I keep saying. I keep really overusing the word troubled.
Bad.
Yeah, understatement of the year also. But yeah, she's very difficult and has lots of callous traits, and you know, that kind of, it's sort of playing with that idea of psychopathic traits, and you know, how is she going to turn out as an adult and all that kind of thing. So it's quite influenced by We Need to Talk About Kevin for that. But I think in terms of, I don't think I could have, it was funny, I pitched a short story which didn't happen in the end, and I'm so glad it didn't, because it was going to go into Elodie's head. The book is written from Sylvie, her mother's point of view, in second person, and I don't know how I would have done it. I don't think I could have written a short story from Elodie's point of view, because the whole point of her is she's quite unknowable, and she almost needs to be unknown, and I feel like she's kind of wired differently to other people, and so if we were to get in her head, well, I just didn't know how I was going to do it, so I was really relieved when it didn't happen. But in terms of, I did for a previous book write a baddie, who I was really struggling with, and she was really two-dimensional until I thought about why she was like she was, and thought about her backstory. And as soon as I'd worked that out, it made complete sense that she was incredibly brittle and bitchy and all that stuff, because she'd had some horrible things happen to her. And I think as soon as you've got, you can let the reader into that. So even if the other characters don't see a more vulnerable side to her, you can do that for the reader, and then they will go along. I've got really mixed feelings about the whole relatable character thing. I don't really like the idea that, you can't centre a book on a bad person and it not being, it's often hugely interesting. Something like Gone Girl, you know, I think works brilliantly with that. And you do sort of sympathise with them. And you look at something like Talented Mr. Ripley as well. He is a psychopath, and there's a series of books about him, so it's not like you don't know he's a psychopath, but you really root for him. And I think in some genres it wouldn't work. If you were writing a romance and your protagonist was horrible, that would be so weird. I mean, I'd be interested to see it done.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe you should do that, genre busting. I can't imagine how it would work, but I would be intrigued to read it. But I think in psychological sort of suspense, the kind of stuff we're writing, I think readers are much more open to that kind of stuff and the fun of actually going along and actually entering the head of someone really horrible. I mean, how do you feel about, you know, writing baddies? Because you've got some really interesting nuanced characters who are, you know, they're not necessarily, I mean, I don't want to offend you with your characters.
Oh my God, no, some of them are awful.
Yeah, some of them are awful and some of them are really, but they're not necessarily, you know, in any way evil or psychopathic, but just unlikable. Some of them are. And how did you approach them, and did you enjoy actually? Because you're a very lovely person, so it must be fun to be horrible in a character.
Oh my God, I mean, I massively have a dark side. My husband actually, when he read The Hunting Party, the first draft of The Hunting Party, he was like, now people will see the dark side that only I know about. And again, I think that was something that I found hugely liberating in writing The Hunting Party, because it was just great fun getting into these characters' heads. And I love, as a reader, I love those kind of love to hate characters, or hate to love. I guess Tom Ripley for me would be a hate to love, because you sort of, you know that you should dislike him and yet you end up rooting for him, and you really don't want him to get caught, and that it takes you to a very uncomfortable place. And so I had a lot of fun creating these characters who are massively flawed, often quite selfish, you know, acted in some pretty reprehensible ways, sometimes to the point of committing murder, you know, so you don't go quite with them to that. But I think the important thing for me was exactly what you said, was understanding exactly what drives them. You know, what makes them how they are, and also showing the reader that to an extent, perhaps with some characters more than others. I never want to write kind of cardboard cutout villains, because I just don't think that's interesting for anyone. And you know, when you think about it, everyone is everyone is the hero in their own story. No one thinks of themselves as the bad guy. So I think when you've got that sort of first person point of view, you can kind of get it, you can really get that idea across, I think, in some ways. You can have them almost explaining themselves to you as the reader. Whether or not you agree with them is another question.
No, that's nice. And if you then do it well, then, like you say, the reader can be taken to quite an uncomfortable place, because they actually find themselves aligned with somebody who is horrible, and that's very interesting. So go on, you carry on.
No, I was just going to say a sort of modern version of kind of a Tom Ripley character that I love is, have you read You by Carolyn Kepner's?
Oh, no.
Oh, it's fantastic. The Netflix series is also amazing.
I've seen the Netflix. I should read the book. That's terrible.
Oh, so the book is brilliant. And but I think it was such a great adaptation, because it was so kind of, he just felt so close for me to my imagination of the character, you know, how I envisaged him. But you know, you really do. I mean, it's so uncomfortable, because he is totally psychopathic, and yet you really do end up rooting for him. And I think it's partly because all the other characters are so awful, so you're like, okay, you can sort of see where he's coming from. Kill him off. But it's also that sort of very insidious voice, you know, it's the way it's written. He sort of really gets inside your head, so you almost start seeing things through his eyes, and that's extremely uncomfortable, but I think a brilliant bit of writing, really clever.
No, I totally agree with that. That made me feel really uncomfortable, and as I said, I've only watched the Netflix, but I think it was really genius casting with him, because I only knew him from Gossip Girl, playing ostensibly quite a similar part, quite sensitive and romantic, or so you thought. So it's almost you taking, I'm trying to think what the character was called, but the one who was going out with Blake, you know.
Yeah.
It's a bit like those two again.
Dan.
Yes, Dan.
Yeah.
And then it all goes wrong, and you kind of, but you're in New York with him, and it feels like it's still him. No, it's really well done, that, and really creepy. And like you say, you know, Peaches, for instance, is odious. Oh. So it's hard to kind of, oh God, well, I won't say what happens to her, but you know, she's somebody who's difficult to love, and yet you should really be on her side. No, that's really interesting. I mean, any other, not necessarily psychological suspense kind of writers, but crime writers, who are your faves? Because you have that thing, I think, as a writer where you read books partly because you kind of want to keep a bit of an eye on the market and what's doing well as books that you would have chosen before you were a writer. And sometimes those are the same and sometimes they're not.
Totally. I mean, I think one of my favourite sort of modern psychological thriller writers would be Lisa Jewell, just because I think, and actually funny enough, she's done a similar thing to what we have, in that she kind of very much came from, I did an event with her and she said she very much came from sort of writing straight kind of women's fiction, you know, as it were, or kind of romantic comedy, and gradually found herself sort of being drawn to the dark side and wanting to kind of write darker and darker stuff. But I think one of the things that's so clever about her writing is she's such a compassionate, you know, talking about kind of understanding your characters, she's such a compassionate writer. So she really understands her characters and sort of what makes them tick. And I think, you know, it's there's often this sort of criticism levied at crime fiction, that it's sort of plot at the expense of character. And I think, actually, when I think about my favourite crime writers, their books, yes, they've got brilliant plots, and she's got wonderfully twisty plots, but she's also very character driven. So the characters are driving plot, you know, nothing feels sort of superimposed on them, it's all coming from them. So I think she's a brilliant example of that. Also a writer like Jane Harper. Yeah. Similarly,
and that's with the setting thing again. That's hugely powerful. I've read two of her books. The one in the kind of, there's a sort of jungly one and a sort of outback heatwavy one, and they're both, that's really. But I so agree about the character thing, and I think what you might have with something like Lisa Jewell, because she's so skilled and she's done those kind of family dramas, is that she's brought all that kind of experience of human relationships and then put it in a really clever twisty plot, and then it's kind of when you've got the best of both worlds then, which is perfect. And I think of crime writers, and this is proper crime, I suppose, rather than sort of domestic drama, it's sort of procedural, but Tana French, I don't know if you know her book. Oh, she's amazing. They did an adaptation actually of a couple of her books. They sort of mashed them into one sort of, which was a bit, I thought actually they could have made more of them, because they're such good stories.
They're so rich, aren't they? There's so much going on.
I don't know why they kind of amalgamated the two, but Tana French's Dublin Murder Squad books, I think, are incredible. And the plots, it's beautifully plotted, and all the police stuff feels completely it just feels totally realistic. But I think what makes those stand out is the characters, and it's not just literally the kind of what they're like, but their dialogue is always funny and sharp and super realistic, lots quite sweary, which I was like, and atmosphere again. I mean, her Ireland in a kind of post-recession, post-Celtic Tiger Ireland is really, really powerful. I think she's amazing, and she has that slightly Gothic edge as well that I love, and I think you probably do.
Absolutely, yeah.
Talking about isolation, I think one of my favourites of hers is The Likeness, which is set in that big house, or partly set in that big house, in the countryside in Ireland, and that's sort of right up my street anyway, that kind of thing. But that's really Gothic, that book.
That's so Gothic, that kind of haunted house feel.
Yeah. Another person I would mention as well, because I know you like her as well, because I think I've seen you quoted for her books, is Susie Steiner.
She's brilliant.
She's brilliant. And again, this is procedural rather than kind of, from the sort of victim's point of view, I suppose. It's the detective is Manon. And she's amazing, and she's the real heart of those books. And again, you've got great plots. and really modern plots with like modern crimes and gangs and that kind of thing. But Manon is what draws you back. She's like this incredible kind of, and she's not very glamorous, but she's, you know, to use that parlance that publishers do, she's very relatable. So she's fab as well. And I know, yeah, you like her too, don't you?
I think it's what I think is really interesting about her books, and actually probably the least of Jaws as well, maybe less Ton of French, is there's quite a lot of humour in them. You know, they're quite funny, and I think there really is a place for that in crime writing. And I'm always sort of in awe of that as a writer. I think there is humour actually in The Guest List and The Hunting Party, but it's probably more satire rather than sort of kind of laugh out loud stuff. But that was something I had a lot of fun with as well, I think, you know, playing around with that.
You can often get secondary characters that you can kind of do that with, and you can almost try that out a bit and think, oh, if I can do this, I might do it a bit more in the next book. But you're not doing too much of it. You've got maybe a funny brother or whatever. I think that's really true, because I think people, and especially, you know, maybe it's a particularly British thing, but that kind of gallows humour, that when the shit really hits the fan, we often joke about it. I mean, I don't know about you, but a lot of friends, and I think I've got quite a dark sense of humour, and it's a way of getting through bad times. And, you know, lots of joking this year with friends about, you know, and it's not a disrespectful thing about what people are going through. It's just a kind of coping mechanism, I think. And I think people in... Go on, sorry.
No, I was going to say, when you think of all the kind of memes that were going around at the beginning of lockdown and things, like it is that, you know, and you get so many every day, and I think it is that sort of, you know, the way people cope with a really difficult situation is often to find levity in it. So right.
Exactly. I wanted to ask, actually, I think we've probably got time quickly, just what you're working on now. You mentioned it briefly.
Yeah, well, yes. It's sort of, I'm currently very pregnant. So you can't see her, but extremely pregnant below the screen. So it's sort of a matter of which comes first, like the final draft or the baby, but I am working on it at the moment. So I'm working on, and it's interesting you mentioned the kind of gothic thing, because I'm working on another murder mystery, but this time set in an apartment building in Paris. So it's a very old apartment building. And if you imagine these apartments sort of arranged around a courtyard. So everyone kind of, so it's that classic Parisian thing. So everyone can kind of see into everyone else's apartment. And all of the suspects are... That's
already a great premise. I already love that, because it's like Rear Window when you're all spying on each other. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So all of the suspects are effectively the people that live in these different apartments. They're all very different characters. So you've got sort of this elderly lady, the concierge figure, who's quite kind of sinister but has her own story going on. You've got the sort of young 20-somethings. You've got like the hot guy who lives in the basement flat. So there are all these sort of different characters with their own sort of motives. And yeah, I've had a lot of fun with it. And I'm now going to get too spoilery, so I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, stop talking. No, that sounds great. That's a really clever premise. I hope you've got those lights in there that go off after 30 seconds.
Yes, the lights on a timer.
They always have that.
It was actually kind of inspired by an Airbnb that I rented to try and I rented it for a week in Paris to try and finish writing the guest list. And so many weird things happened in this apartment building when I was staying there, and there were like these weird noises from upstairs, first thing in the morning and last thing at night. It was like the sound of someone dragging like really heavy furniture around. And it was honestly, like as a crime writer, you immediately start thinking they're like hiding a body up there or something. Oh, yeah, something really weird going on. You know, it's like Edgar Allan Poe stuff.
Yeah, completely.
But the other thing was those lights. So there's this classic thing in a sort of French apartment buildings. You have those lights on a timer, and they sort of count you down, like tick down. So you're trying to make your way up kind of these multiple flights of stairs, because they're
always really dark.
And then you're plunged into darkness. Yeah. So that was a brilliant thing to be able to use as a writer.
Well, that sounds great.
You, what's next?
So mine is probably going to be, I say probably because I was supposed to go to Italy and research it, and I didn't get to go this year, but I think it is set in Italy, and it's the story of a British couple who've kind of reached the end of the road a bit in their relationship, They're sort of turning 40, and they decide to sell up and go to Italy and run a kind of luxury guest house and do a kind of escape to the chateau. Well, that's a British program, so that doesn't mean anything to anyone. And basically they have, they're getting in a real panic because they've spent all this money on the place and they aren't getting any bookings. And then suddenly, just when they think they're going to have to give up and go home, an American couple book 3 weeks out, which is going to save them. And they arrive and they're quite glamorous and quite mysterious. And it all kind of, it gets a bit weird. And at first it's quite sort of flirty. And then it all gets a bit dark. And again, I'm going to go into spoiler territory and also into unknown territory because I'm only about a fifth of the way in. But that's basically it.
Oh my God, it sounds brilliant. I'm getting goosebumps.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read it.
Yeah.
I want to read them both right now. They sound great.
Yeah.
In order to avoid barking, we now have a visitor. So, we're working from home today. Yeah. So this is Maisie Dogs, since you two haven't met her before. So she is.
Hi, Maisie.
Enjoying International Dog Day. We do have a couple questions, so let's get to those. So Catherine asks, what is your writing process and what was the first thought that began the writing of these books?
Ooh. Well, then, Lucy, I'll let you go first this time.
Yeah, so the guest list, it's quite evil because really it was that as someone in their kind of early-ish 30s, I've been to a lot of weddings in the last few years. And it just, and they've obviously been wonderful occasions, I should say that, disclaimer, or I'll never go my one again. You know, it did really occur to me that you have all of these people gathered together in one place, all these very different groups of people. You've got kind of family members, you've got old friends, new friends, all sort of rubbing up against each other. And you've also got kind of emotions and tensions running potentially really high. And I just thought that is the sort of perfect sort of pressure cooker situation in a way, if things start going a bit wrong and people have brought some rather unpleasant baggage with them to the wedding. So I think that was my starting off point. And then the other thing was the location. So it was traveling to these islands off the west coast of Ireland, you know, getting the boat over there, this really hairy crossing, and then standing there sort of looking out to the Atlantic and kind of feeling the wind buffeting you and hearing the wind kind of whistling through these sort of abandoned buildings where people used to live, and just thinking this is like the perfect place to set it. It's sort of at once very beautiful, so the sort of place that you might actually choose to have a wedding, but at the same time could kind of become quite a hostile environment, sort of nature red and tooth and claw. So those are my kind of two notes that I took for the guest list.
Yeah, that's funny because I had a very similar, again, with our, obviously we love our locations. And my first thing was that I was, by hook or by crook, I was going to set a book in France, any book, but I wanted to write and set it in France. So that was one. Particularly the south of France, because I think I've stayed in lots of parts of France and loved them all. But there was something, again, it's that kind of nature being a bit more extreme. We were talking about the weather before we came on. And I thought, well, in the south of France, I can maybe have forest fires and heat waves and have that intensity. But I think the other thing, I actually started, the book is a mother and daughter book about toxic relationship between a mother and a daughter, and a mother that can't connect and doesn't know if she is getting it right with her child and loves her child and would die for her child, but maybe doesn't like her that much, and all that tricky territory. But actually the first thought was I was going to have sibling rivalry. I was going to have two sisters, where the younger sister was living in the shadow of the daughter that had died, the elder daughter that died, who was so beautiful and charismatic and special, and the one that her parents never talked about because she thought they'd never got over her and she could never live up to this older sister, and then discovers that it's actually the opposite and that this older sister was very difficult. And it didn't work out that way because I ended up wanting to write from the mother's point of view. But yeah, originally it was kind of France and then these two sisters. So that was where I started. I think there was also the question about process. So just very quickly, I am bad at routine. I'm yet to find my routine. So I think we've talked about plotting and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of day to day, I mean, I don't know about you, Lucy, but I certainly polish as I go, which means I can't just do a quick rough draft and then see where I am. I'm polishing every single scene, which means that down the line, I have to cut those scenes, and it's very painful. I don't know how it is for you.
I'm awful. I just kind of, I don't think I could look at a scene again until I get to the very end. So I just get the words down, get the draft written, and then, but I almost think that's worth, because then you come back to it and you're like, wow, you know, I really should have polished as I went along. I just kind of vomited a lot of stuff onto the page. But no, I mean, my main target is sort of word count based. So I have, which doesn't sound very sexy, but I have like a word count that I want to get to every day. And some days that will take kind of the whole day, you know, it'll take from like 8 in the morning to 8 at night. Other days, it's just for whatever reason, the words are flowing and, you know, it'll take me the morning. And then sometimes I give myself the rest of the day.
If you've done your...
Yeah, sometimes.
That's good. That's good.
I'm going to read, well, in the olden days when you could go to the cinema, I'd like take myself to the cinema and like go and watch a film or something. Like, this is all inspiration, I think.
Yeah. So, yeah. I might copy that, because I'm hopeless. I'm really inefficient. So I'm going to try that, the word count. And then, yes, if you've finished in 2 hours or 3. Yeah, that's a great idea.
Just incentivize yourself. Andrea asks, which character has been the most fun for you to write, and is that character most like you?
Ooh, wow.
One. Well, I've got one actually that sprung to mind immediately, which is, I do love Sylvie, who's my protagonist, but her sister Camille, I really enjoyed writing. She's very spiky and quite sort of, she doesn't have children, and she never wanted children. She lives, you know, Sylvie lives in London at the beginning of the book, but most of the book takes place in rural France. Camille got out of the village as soon as she could and went to Paris and has a series of gentleman friends and a very footloose and fancy-free life. And she is incredibly supportive of Sylvie in certain ways, but she's more of a reassuring presence than a kind of kind, soft presence. And she was really fun to write because she's sarky, and she was quite rude to Sylvie's ex-husband, who's hopeless and not helpful with the children at all. So she was really fun to write, and I could picture her. She had a kind of dark, shiny bob, and was just very Parisian and very glam. And I enjoyed writing. And she's nothing like me, so that was fun. And I certainly prefer. I think my protagonists end up with quite a dollop of me in, but I'd had more fun in a sense with the other characters because they're really not me. And then I can kind of go off on one, and that's fun.
Yeah, I'd agree. I sort of have fun, you know, because I'm always, you know, very worried about kind of, you know, being liked and not saying things that'll offend people. And so I love writing those characters that just say the really awful thing that everyone's thinking and that you really shouldn't say. So like, I think in The Hunting Party, the first murder mystery, I loved writing the character of Miranda because she's sort of a golden girl, but she's also, you know, kind of awful, but you're sort of at the same time drawn to her. I think in a way, everyone sort of knows someone a bit like that. You're sort of drawn to them despite yourselves because they sort of bring the party and they're great fun to be around, but they're also, you know, they'll say things that are really cutting and sort of catty and nasty, but at the same time,
those kind of friends that you read like in women's magazines, they're toxic friends and you should cut them out of your life, but you often can't. It's funny.
Totally. And that said though, in the guest list, I loved writing the character of Hannah, who is, so they all sort of have their labels. So, you know, there's the bride, Jules, there's the groom, although he doesn't appear until a bit later, there's the best man, Jono, and then there's the +1, Hannah. And I loved writing her because she is the +1. So she's sort of a bit of an outsider to this sort of group of kind of very entitled people who are getting together for this wedding. And so in a sense, she is my sort of eyes and ears as the author into the story, but she's also kind of you as the reader. You're sort of the outsider looking in. So she was a lot of fun to write, and also just sort of just looking at these people behaving terribly and thinking like, oh my God, you're like children. You know, it was quite a lot of fun to have her sort of stepping back, I think, and writing that. So, and
that's a bit like your authorial voice then coming through almost to the reader, sort of saying, I do know these people are kind of terrible.
Totally. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question that's a little bit bigger in scope. So Vishal asks, it's a long question, bear with me. What do you feel is the trajectory of that crime fiction is treading upon right now? What do you think will encompass this genre in this decade? I mean, the 2010s were all about psychological thrillers, and the decade prior was all about pacey and historical thrillers. Is the scale of a crime novel reducing from a globe-spanning phenomena to a cottage in the countryside?
Wow.
Wow, that is a
great question.
Right, Lucy, you can start with that one.
It is. I mean, one of the things that really excites me as someone that loves the sort of the kind of country house setting, and also that sort of closed circle setting, is that there has been a bit of a resurgence of the sort of books that I'm writing, so these kind of murder mysteries. And I think one of the things that really excited me was that you saw that with a film like Knives Out coming out, you know, which was just so brilliantly done. And I think just encapsulated everything I love about the genre, and will hopefully sort of perpetuate this kind of subgenre having a bit of a moment, but how long that's going to last for, or like, you know, whether that's going to come to define the decade, who knows? I think that's one of the exciting things as a reader and a writer, is you don't know what's going to be the kind of zeitgeist in the next 10 years time. What do you think, Kate? I mean,
I agree with you. I think you often don't know, and you can kind of drive, as a writer sort of trying to make a living, you can drive yourself mad trying to work out where the trends are going. And if you do that, if you follow that too much, you can often just miss it. I mean, we know how long it takes to go from an idea to getting it, you know, someone to buy the idea, and then you write it and you edit it, and then they bring it out in the month they want. And you'll often get a deal and maybe the book will come out 18 months later. So if you're trying to kind of ride a wave of a trend, you're going to miss it probably. So I think it's a kind of, we were talking about Lisa Jewell and how good she is at, you know, bringing in that very intelligent sort of dynamics, human dynamics into a kind of psychological plot. And I don't know if maybe we'll see more of that, more kind of cross-fertilization. I would be saying this because we're like moving genres, but you know, that kind of writers from other areas using other parts of that. So I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, I know in publishing, the kind of really straight psychological domestic thriller, I think lots of people in publishing privately are a bit fed up of it and kind of want things to change up now. But there still seems to be a real appetite for that stuff, you know, about couples and, you know, and stuff that could ostensibly happen to you. I don't actually still think that's not really going anywhere. What will define a 10-year period? And I mean, I'd love to know what's going to be super popular in about 2023. That would be super helpful. So if any, you know, sort of trend predictors want to let us know. I think you just have to write what people, you know, there's that adage about write what you know. I think write what you want to read, actually. I think often, you know, you will think, oh, I'd love to read a book that's a bit like this, but it's got a bit of, you know, is a bit sexy and is in a really beautiful place. And I wanted to do that with this, that kind of bad things happening in beautiful places, which you've totally done with yours. And I think, you know, if you want to read that kind of book and maybe you can't find it, or you've read all the books that are like that, then write that yourself. I don't know.
And when I think, you know, that was really something, because I came to writing from a publishing background. So I was a fiction editor, and we spent a lot of time, almost as we do as writers, sort of tying ourselves in knots, trying to work out what would be the trends, you know, and what we should be commissioning, you know, now to kind of publish in a year's time, 2 years' time. But I think, you know, that kind of lacks creativity, that approach, really. And I think, you know, there would always be the book that would come in from kind of totally left field and sort of blow everything out of the water in publishing. Yeah. And we could be very sort of imitative in the way that we publish. You know, it would be like, well, we can't publish a book about this because it's sort of never been done before and it hasn't worked before. But I think the exciting thing about publishing is that, the exciting thing about the book industry is that that there will always be a book that makes that work, you know, that kind of wacky idea. Expressing it very well, but I think
you are.
I think it's absolutely that. I think it's writing the book that really excites you, because it will excite other people too. Definitely.
And you're so right that it's those books that they don't just come in and they really like just stay on at the top of the bestseller charts. I mean, Eleanor Oliphant is the one.
I was just thinking Eleanor Oliphant,
immediately, and that just did not move from the top 10 for so long. And write that down on a napkin, and you'd be kind of like, but it, you know, it did brilliantly. So I mean, if there are any people out there listening who are trying to write a book, I wouldn't get too bogged down with what's selling and I think talent maybe will out with that kind of thing. And if you've written something amazing and interesting and that arrests somebody's attention, I think it doesn't really matter, actually.
Yeah, it's all in the execution and the voice, isn't it? Voice is so important. If you've got a really powerful voice, as Eleanor Oliphant does, you know, it will just win people over, I think.
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
We have one other question, but before I get to that, a couple business things. So if you've tuned in late to this Facebook Live discussion, as soon as the talk is over, you can watch the video from the beginning under our videos tab. Plus, I'll get it uploaded to our YouTube channel and make sure that the authors are tagged on social media so that they know it's up there on YouTube in I don't know, a day or two. There's a hurricane coming, so be gentle with that estimate. Also, I wanted to chime in about the trends. I actually work as a publishing consultant for a crime fiction imprint, and I'm asked all the time about trends since I've been at the store for a really long time. I will say one of the things that Lucy said is that these books have been in the works for several years now. I've been commenting on the return of Gothic fiction and classic constraints in whether it's, you know, closed cast, locked rooms, remote destinations, things they're seeing particularly in Lucy's books. Those have been something I've been telling editors about for some time because we've seen that interest. My own personal theory, whether wanted or not, is that in times of kind of difficult political unrest or trying times, people want books that have closure. They may have a puzzle, but they have closure. And so a lot of the classic style mysteries with a plot, you know, with red herrings and all of that, do have closure. So these books have been in the works for a while, and our world has been a little tumultuous for a while, so there may be some connection there. But I have to say personally that any book with these descriptions I want to read. So for me, it's a win-win.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
So our last.
It's really interesting to hear your take.
Well, and since March, we have sold hundreds of Agatha Christie books at the bookstore, because people and Golden Age mysteries or books along this line, because if you have no control in real life, it's nice to know that what you're reading is going to give you some control and good is going to win out. And so those kind of books have done extremely well during this time. No, you know, very, very dark there's enough darkness right now, so they're not the biggest sellers. But anyway, there's that. So the last question from the comments is, where do you get your character names?
Ooh, that's a good one. I love doing character names, actually. I wrote a book set in Cornwall, and I had Cornwall in the very southwest corner of Britain, and they have very particular names, and I really enjoyed, and I went through kind of birth and death records and things to find those. For the French names, again, I mean, Google's really helpful. I was Googling, kind of working out when people were born, and then Googling baby names for that decade. Elodie, I had immediately. I wanted something really melodic and pretty because she is beautiful, and I make such a fuss of that all the way through. And it was something, I don't know, it just sounds, it's very French. And I wanted Emma, the younger sister, to have a much kind of plainer, simpler English name, but both be E. And then I think, Sylvie and Camille, they just all sort of, they're just lovely French names that I've come across
beautiful names
on holiday. And I mean, just French is just gorgeous anyway. So that was easy for me. And then surnames, I actually had Olivier, who's the sort of flirtation in the book. He's a solicitor that Sylvie has a bit of a kind of thing with. And I actually had a really famous footballer's name for quite a long time. And then I heard on the radio that he was transferring from one team to, and I was like, it was Olivier Giroud. And I was like, oh, that's a great name. That sounds really natural. And then, yeah, I realised that it was because it was a very famous footballer. So I had to change that. But yeah. So how about you, Lucy? I mean, how did you?
Yeah, I think I've done that before, given someone a surname, a first name and a surname, being like, yes, it just has this wonderful ring to it. And then realised it's because it's someone in the public eye.
Yeah.
I don't know, for me, I love your process, but for me, it's sort of, I try a few names on them sometimes, and for some reason, probably like naming a child or something, certain names just fit, they just feel right for those characters. Having said that, probably in the hunting party with the women's names, I did think about that quite carefully, and sort of Miranda, is a sort of Shakespearean heroine name, which is sort of just right for this sort of golden girl. And then the other names are much kind of Katie and Emma, lovely English names, but much more simple, in comparison to her. So they're sort of more wallflower. No, not wallflower.
Watch
no,
it.
I love my sister's called Kate. Love the name, love Kate. But I think with Miranda, it was always my thing, because my mum says, because I was given the most boring kind of 90s name, Lucy. I mean, like there were like 6 Lucys in my class. I've grown to love it. Yeah. But my mum said she kind of wished she'd called me Miranda. And so in a way, maybe she's my like dark alter ego.
Maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. So there's
you
that.
You should tell your husband that. He could call you, when you're being dark, he can call you Miranda.
Miranda. But no, I did hear a really fascinating thing, which I'm going to try, which is, I think, Sophie Hannah, who writes the sort of the Agatha Christie's now. She goes to churchyards and looks at graves.
Oh, I do that as well. Yes, I do that.
Do you do that too? I think that's brilliant. Yeah,
it's so good. I've done that. I've obviously not for this book, because it was a lot of French names, but yeah, I've got loads of beautiful. I live in the Cotswolds, as I said at the beginning, and lots of beautiful churchyards, and you get, that's brilliant for kind of a particular area as well. You get certain surnames that come up, and it's just nice to visit those anyway. But did you know, we talked about Scrivener? Scrivener has a name generator.
Does it? I haven't discovered this function. That's fascinating.
There's a lot of, I use about 5% of what Scrivener can do, but I did discover that, so there you are.
All right, so that is going to conclude our conversation. I have to say this was an absolute treat for me. Thank you, ladies, both so much. If you're watching and enjoying our virtual events, we would love nothing more than for you to consider ordering the books from us. It took forever, but we finally have stacks of the guest list back in stock. And then we also, of course, have The Heat Wave by Kate Riordan just out. We will be back tonight with Victoria Laurie and Juliet Blackwell. Our event tomorrow night has been postponed to September 8th. And then for those of you who heard the praise and lively discussion about Tana French, we are actually doing an event October 14th for The Searcher, her new book. So we're very excited. We just got that confirmed. And the publisher is looking for a conversation partner. I will pass along your names if
I would be starstruck. I wouldn't be able to speak.
I know, me neither.
So anyway, thank you again both so much. Best of luck with the books, and I can't wait to read your next ones, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.